Christmas Eve is supposed to be a time of joy, laughter, and family, but that night, it became something I could never forget. Our house was alive with holiday cheer, lights twinkling on the tree, the aroma of freshly baked cookies wafting through the air, and carols playing softly in the background. It was perfect, or so I thought. At some point during the evening, my mom asked me to grab something from the basement. Extra wrapping paper, I think. The basement was always my least favorite part of the house. It was cold, dimly lit, and filled with the odd creaks and groans of an old home settling into itself. But it was Christmas, and I didn't want to ruin the festive mood by complaining. I flicked on the basement light and descended the wooden steps, each creak of the boards echoing in the stillness. The basement was cluttered with storage boxes and old furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. It smelled faintly of damp concrete, a sharp contrast to the warmth upstairs. I moved quickly, scanning the shelves for the wrapping paper. That's when I noticed it, a large lump under one of the blankets in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was just a chair or an oddly shaped pile of boxes, but something about it felt wrong. The shape wasn't quite right. It was too low to the ground, too uneven. My heart began to race as I took a step closer, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then the light went out. The sudden darkness swallowed me whole, and for a moment I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some light. The tiny glow from the screen barely illuminated the room, but it was enough to see that the lump under the blanket was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it began to rise. A strangled gasp escaped my throat as the blanket slipped off, revealing a figure crouched on the floor. I couldn't make out their face, but I could feel their eyes on me, heavy and unblinking. "Who's there?" I stammered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it moved closer, silent, deliberate, and horrifyingly fast. Before I could react, they lunged, knocking me to the ground. A cold hand clamped around my throat, squeezing with terrifying strength. I struggled, kicking and clawing, but the grip tightened. My vision blurred as panic set in, the weight of their body pinning me to the cold concrete floor. The sounds from upstairs, the laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, felt impossibly distant, like they belonged to another world. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My lungs burned, and for a moment I thought this was it. This was how it would end. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the weight was gone. The figure bolted up the stairs, the basement door slamming shut behind them. I lay there, gasping for air, too terrified to move. It wasn't until I heard my dad's voice calling my name that I managed to crawl up the stairs. I burst into the living room, shaking and choking on sobs. The festive atmosphere evaporated in an instant as my family rushed to my side, their faces etched with confusion and concern. The police were called, but they found no sign of the intruder. The basement door had been left unlocked, and there were muddy footprints leading away from the house, but no other evidence. They couldn't explain how the person had gotten in, or why they had targeted me. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every shadow in the corner of my room sent me spiraling into panic. My family tried to reassure me, but I could see it in their eyes. They were just as shaken as I was. The thought that someone had been down there hiding among our old belongings, waiting for the right moment to strike, was something none of us could fully process. Even now, years later, Christmas Eve isn't the same. The lights, the music, the smell of cookies, they all feel tainted. Because no matter how safe or warm a place might seem, you can never really know what's hiding just below the surface. It was my first Christmas without Mom. Dad tried to make it feel normal. He strung up lights, baked cookies with me, and played Christmas music on repeat. But the house felt emptier, colder, despite the holiday cheer. Then Sydney entered the picture. Dad had been seeing Sydney for a few months, and while she was friendly enough, something about her didn't sit right with me. She was too perfect. Her bright smile never seemed to reach her eyes. Still, Dad adored her, and she seemed determined to win me over. On Christmas Eve, she moved in with us. It was supposed to be temporary, just for the holidays, Dad said. Sydney brought boxes of decorations and gifts, filling the house with a strange kind of energy, warm and inviting on the surface, but something else simmered beneath. That night, after the festivities died down, I woke to the sound of footsteps. The clock on my bedside table read 2:14 a.m. Curious, I slipped out of bed and crept down the hallway. The glow from the living room spilled into the corridor, and I peeked around the corner. Sydney was sitting cross-legged on the floor, rifling through Dad's wallet. She pulled out his credit cards and studied them, then slid them back in like nothing happened. My stomach twisted. What was she doing? I watched as she moved to the kitchen, opening drawers and cupboards like she was searching for something. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bottle of pills. She swapped it with another bottle from the counter, her movements quick and precise, like she'd done this before. I stepped back into the shadows, my heart pounding. I didn't understand what I'd just seen, but it didn't feel right. I wanted to tell Dad, but how could I? Sydney was his first real connection since Mom, and I didn't want to ruin that for him. Instead, I decided to keep an eye on her. The next day, Sydney was all smiles, handing out presents and baking cookies like nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the unease. Every time she glanced my way, I felt a chill, like she knew I'd seen something I shouldn't have. That night, I couldn't sleep. The events from the previous night played over and over in my head. I stayed awake, listening for any sign of movement. Around midnight, I heard it again. Soft footsteps on the stairs. This time I followed them more closely, staying hidden in the shadows. Sydney was in Dad's room, standing over him as he slept. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her reach into her pocket and pull out something small and metallic. It gleamed in the dim light. A key. She used it to open a locked drawer on Dad's bedside table, taking out a stack of papers. She flipped through them quickly, then slipped them into her robe. I couldn't stay quiet anymore. "What are you doing?" I blurted out, stepping into the doorway. Sydney spun around, her face a mask of surprise that quickly morphed into something darker. "I could ask you the same thing," she said, her voice icy. "I saw you last night with Dad's wallet. And the pills. What are you doing?" My voice trembled, but I held my ground. She stepped toward me, her movements slow and deliberate. "You don't understand," she said, her tone sickly sweet. "Your dad and I are trying to build a future. Sometimes that means making adjustments." "Adjustments?" I echoed, disbelief washing over me. She tilted her head, her smile returning but colder this time. "You wouldn't want to ruin this, would you? For your dad?" I took a step back, panic rising. "I'm telling him." Before I could move, she grabbed my arm, her grip iron tight. "No, you're not," she hissed, leaning in close. "You're just a kid. No one will believe you, and if you try, you'll regret it." Fear coursed through me as she released my arm and walked back to her room, clutching the stolen papers. I stood frozen in the hallway, my mind racing. I wanted to wake Dad to tell him everything, but her words echoed in my head. "No one will believe you." The next morning, Sydney acted as if nothing had happened. She served breakfast with a smile, chatting with Dad about their plans for the day. I sat silently, watching her every move, searching for cracks in her facade. But she was flawless, perfectly in control. As the day wore on, I realized I couldn't stay quiet. I waited until Sydney left the house to run errands and finally told Dad everything. About the wallet, the pills, the stolen papers. He didn't believe me at first, but when I showed him the marks on my arm where she'd grabbed me, doubt flickered in his eyes. That evening, Sydney returned, her cheerful demeanor intact. But something in the air had shifted. Dad confronted her, and as he spoke, her mask began to slip. She denied everything at first, but when Dad mentioned the papers, her expression hardened. "I did it for us," she said, her voice cold. You don't see it yet, but I was protecting you. Dad told her to leave, his voice trembling with anger and betrayal. Sydney didn't argue. She simply gathered her things and left, but not before giving me one last look, a mixture of anger and something else I couldn't place. Christmas wasn't the same after that. The decorations, the music, the warmth, they all felt hollow. Dad and I never spoke about Sydney again, but the scars she left behind lingered. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't followed her that night, if I hadn't spoken up. Sometimes the people we let into our homes, the people we think we can trust, are the ones hiding the darkest secrets.